Let's now look at illustration number 37. A lessee enters into a 10-year lease for 2000 square meters of office space. The annual lease payments are 1 lakh, which is payable at the end of each year. The interest rate implicit in lease cannot be readily determined, and the incremental borrowing rate is 6% per annum. At the beginning of year six, all right, again, 5 years have passed by. We're standing at the beginning of year six. The lessee and the lessor agree to amend the original lease to A, include an additional 1500 square meters of space in the same building starting from the beginning of year six. All right, so the scope of lease is increasing from 2000 to 3500. It's increasing by 1500 from 2000 square meters to 3500 square meters. So this is a case of increase in the scope of lease. B, there is another change also. One was A and the other is B. We are looking to reduce the lease term from 10 years to 8 years. All right, so the lease term is actually decreasing from 10 years to 8 years. The annual fixed payment was for 3,500 square meters is 1,50,000. All right, for 2,000 square meters, it was 1 lakh. For 3,500 square meters, it is 1,50,000 payable at the end of each year from year 6 to year 8. Why do we have only from year 6 to year 8? Because the lease term has now reduced to 8 years. All right, so the lease payments that are going to be made in future is 1,50,000 per annum. The lessee's incremental borrowing rate at the beginning of each year 6 is 7% per annum. All right, we have the incremental borrowing rate at the beginning of year 6 as 7% per annum. The consideration for the increase in scope of 1500 square meters of space is not commensurate with the standalone price for that increase adjusted to reflect the circumstances of the contract. All right. So the increase in scope, the consideration that we are paying for the increase in scope is not commensurate with the standalone price. All right. If it was commensurate, we would have treated that as a separate lease or an additional lease, but here it's given that it is not commensurate. Consequently, lessee does not account for the increase in scope that adds to the right of use an additional 1500 square meters of space as a separate lease. All right, so the lessee does not account for it as a separate lease is what the question has mentioned. How should the said modification be accounted for is the question. Now, what we would do is we would first actually deal with the reduction in lease term. Where there is a decrease in lease term, we would actually first calculate the amount of ROU asset that needs to be derecognized. We'll calculate the amount of lease liability that needs to be derecognized. We will calculate a gain or loss on derecognition. We're going to calculate a gain or loss on derecognition. So with that, we'll be done with the reduction in lease term. Later on, because there's an increase in the scope of lease, which is not commensurate. All right, the consideration for the such increase in scope of lease is not commensurate with the market rate. Therefore, over here we will be calculating the revised lease liability, compare it with the lease liability that we have in the books of accounts, and we will make a corresponding adjustment to ROU asset. All right, so let's start with illustration number 37. So similar to all the previous examples, we will actually start off by calculating the lease liability on the date of commencement of lease. What was the lease liability on the date of commencement of lease? So we would have years. The number of years was years 1 to 10. All right. Because the contract was for a period of 10 years, we have years 1 to 10. We then have cash flow. The cash flow was mentioned as 1 lakh, which is payable at the end of each year. All right. So the cash flow is equal to 1 lakh. The present value factor would be calculated at 6%. And then we have discounted cash flow. All right. So we calculate the present value factor for 6% for a period of 10 years. And that was going to be equal to 7.3601. All right, so the present value annuity factor is 7.3601 multiplied by 1 lakh is going to be equal to 7 lakh 36,001 rupees. All right, it's 7.3601 multiplied by 1 lakh, which is equal to 7 lakh 36,001 rupee. All right, so on the date of commencement, we would be recognizing a right of use asset of 7,36,000 and a corresponding lease liability of 7,36,001 rupee. All right, this is on the date of commencement. Now, at the beginning of year six, we are standing at the beginning of year six. We got to now calculate the carrying amount of the ROU asset and the carrying amount of the lease liability. The carrying amount of ROU asset, remember, is going to be equal to 7,36,001 rupees, 7,36,001 less the depreciation for 5 years. Depreciation for 5 years is going to be 7,36,001 divided by 10 years multiplied by 5. 7,36,001 divided by 10 is going to give you the depreciation per annum, multiplied by 5 is going to give the depreciation for a period of 5 years, and this is going to be equal to 3,68,001 rupees. All right, I'm just rounding it off. 3,68,001 rupee will be the carrying amount of the right of use asset. Then we have to calculate the carrying amount of the lease liability at the beginning of year six. What is the carrying amount of lease liability at the beginning of year six? For this, we will be preparing the lease liability schedule. All right, we have years. We then have opening balance. We have interest at the rate of 6%. We will have interest at the rate of 6%, the payments, and then we finally have closing balance. All right, now for year one, we are going to have the opening balance equal to 7,36,001 rupee. All right, whatever was the lease liability that we initially recorded, that will become the opening balance, which is 7,36,001 rupee. Now we are going to calculate interest at 6%. That is going to be equal to 44,160. I have a payment of 1 lakh. So my closing balance is going to be equal to 736,001 plus 44,160 less 1 lakh, which is equal to 6,80,161. I then have year 2, beginning balance will be 6,80,161. I calculate interest at 6%, that is going to be equal to 40,810 less payment of 1 lakh rupees. The closing balance will be 680,161 plus 40,810 less 1 lakh, which is equal to 6,20,971. Next, I've got year 3, where the beginning balance will be 6,20,971 multiplied by 6% will give me the interest for year 3, which is 37,258. I reduce 1 lakh, which is paid at the end of year 3, which is going to be 620,971 plus 37,258 less 1 lakh, which is equal to 5,58,229. Now for year 4, I have a beginning balance of 5,58,229. I calculate interest at the rate of 6%, which would be equal to 33,494 less 1 lakh is going to be equal to 558,229 plus 33,494 less 1 lakh is equal to 4,91,723. I then have year 5, where the beginning balance will be 4,91,723 multiplied by 6% will give me the interest for year 6, which is 29,503 less 1 lakh is going to give me the closing balance at the end of 5th year. That is 491,723 plus 29,503 less 1 lakh, which is equal to 4,21,226. So this is my lease liability at the end of year 5. This is the lease liability at the end of year 5 or beginning of year 6. All right, so the carrying amount of lease liability at the beginning of year 6 is going to be 4,21,226. 4,21,226 is the carrying amount of the lease liability at the beginning of year 6. Now over here, we have a decrease in lease term. All right, remember, we have a remaining lease term at the beginning of year 6. We have a remaining lease term originally the remaining lease term before modification was equal to 5 years. All right, before modification, the remaining lease term was actually equal to 5 years. All right, the total term was 10 years. I'm standing at the beginning of year 6. So I have got year 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10. So the remaining lease term was 5 years. After modification, the total life has reduced, the total lease term has reduced from 10 years to 8 years. The total lease term has reduced from 10 years to 8 years, which means the remaining lease term after modification is going to be equal to 3 years. All right. So I have now year 6, 7, and 8 left. Therefore, the remaining lease term is 3 years. The percentage reduction in lease term, the percentage reduction in remaining lease term is going to be equal to 40 percentage again. All right. The percentage reduction in remaining lease term is going to be 2 divided by 5 multiplied by 100. Unfortunately, we have the same 40 percentage. All right. We have the same 40 percentage as in our illustrations earlier. So the percentage reduction in lease term is actually equal to 40 percentage. Now, what we are going to do is we have an ROU asset. We have in the books of accounts ROU asset of rupees to 3,68,001 rupee. We have an ROU asset in the books of accounts at the beginning of year 6 of 3,68,001 rupees. All right. We have reduced our lease term by a period of 2 years. We have reduced our lease term by a period of 2 years. Therefore, what we are going to do is we will reduce the carrying amount of the ROU asset also by 40 percentage. We will derecognize our ROU asset also by 40 percentage. Therefore, ROU asset derecognition, the ROU asset derecognition is going to be equal to 3,68,001 rupee, 3,68,001 multiplied by 40 percentage, that is going to be equal to 1,47,200. All right. So the amount of ROU asset that I will derecognize is going to be 1,47,200. All right. So the carrying amount of ROU asset, after derecognition, after 40% derecognition is going to be equal to 368,001 less 147,200. So that is going to be equal to 2,20,801. All right, so it's going to be 2,20,801. The carrying amount of the ROU asset after 40% derecognition is 2,20,801. Now, I also need to calculate the lease liability derecognition amount. All right. Now, just like how we calculated the ROU asset derecognition as 368,001 multiplied by 40 percentage, can we also calculate the lease liability derecognition as 4,21,000 multiplied by 40 percentage? The answer is no. In case of a reduction in lease term, we cannot apply the formula of carrying amount multiplied by percentage reduction in lease term. All right, we cannot apply the formula of 4,21,000 multiplied by 40 percentage in case of a decrease in lease term. In case of a decrease in lease term, what we are actually going to do is we will be calculating the reduction in liability, because I'm actually no longer going to make payments for year 9 and 10. I am no longer obligated to make the payments of 1 lakh rupees for year 9 and 10. I will be actually calculating the amount of derecognition by actually seeing how much money I no longer am required to pay. How much money am I no longer required to pay? I will be taking its present value into today's terms, and I will be calculating that amount as the reduction in lease liability. The amount that I no longer have to pay to the lessor is going to be calculated as the reduction or the derecognition of lease liability. All right. So how do we calculate lease liability? Remember, I'm standing at the beginning of year 6. I'm standing at the beginning of year 6. And as a result of the reduction in lease term, I am no longer required to pay. I don't have to pay payment for year 9 and year 10. I no longer actually have to pay lease payments for year 9 and 10. The total contract has now reduced to a period of 8 years. Therefore, I no longer have to pay year 9 and 10. Year 9 is basically 4 years away from today. All right. Year 9 is 4 years away from today. I'm standing at the beginning of year 6 or end of year 5. So year 9 is basically 4 years away from today, and year 10 is 5 years away from today. Year 10 is 5 years away from today. The cash flow that I no longer have to pay is 1 lakh. 1 lakh for year 9 and 1 lakh for year 10, and I take the present value factor at the original rate of 6 percentage. Why am I taking the original rate of 6 percentage? Because the carrying amount of the lease liability, this 4,21,226, actually includes payments for year 9 and 10 as well. Remember, this 4,21,000 is the present value of payments from year 6 to year 10 discounted at the rate of 6 percentage. You can recalculate this 4,21,000 121,226 as the present value of the payments from year 6 to year 10 at 6%. Now, from this value, I need to de-recognize. Therefore, what I'm actually calculating is 1 lakh for year 9 and 1 lakh for year 10 discounted at the rate of 6%. All right, this is included in 4 lakh 21. I have to remove it from there. Therefore, I'm actually discounting it at 6%. This is going to be 1 divided by 1.06 whole power 4, and this is going to be 1 divided by 1.06 whole power 5. All right, so it's going to be equal to 0.7921, and the last year is going to be 0.7473. All right, I'm discounting it by 4 years and 5 years because I'm standing at the beginning of year 6. So ninth year payment is 4 years away from today. 10th year payment is 5 years away from today. I then have discounted cash flow for the for payment for year 9. It's going to be 79,210, and for year 10 it will be 74,730. The sum total is going to be 79,210 plus 74,730, which is equal to 1,53,940. All right, this 153,940 basically represents the amount of obligation that I no longer have to pay. I don't have to pay obligation for 9 and 10. Therefore, this 1,53,000 basically represents a reduction in my liability. I no longer have to pay this amount. Therefore, this is representing the derecognition of liability. This is the amount by which my liability should actually reduce. All right, so I have ROU asset which needs to reduce by 147,200. I have liability which needs to reduce by 153,940. All right, so I basically am going to debit lease liability by 153,940. I will credit ROU asset by 147,200. All right, so I am basically going to debit lease liability. I will be debiting lease liability by this amount of 1,53,940 because this is the amount that I no longer have to pay. All right. And then I credit ROU asset. I will credit ROU asset by 1,47,200. I'm crediting it by 1,47,200, and I have a differential gain on derecognition. I'm having a gain on derecognition, which is going to be equal to 1,53,940 less 147,200, which is equal to 6,740. All right, so I am going to recognize a gain on derecognition of 6,740. How did we calculate the amount of lease liability to be recognized? I've actually calculated how much liability do I no longer have to pay. In present value terms, that came down to 153,940, which is equal to the liability derecognition amount. Now, the carrying amount of lease liability, after derecognition. Remember, we calculated the carrying amount of ROU asset after 40% derecognition. Same way, I'm calculating the carrying amount of the lease liability after derecognition of 153,940. That is going to be equal to, I originally had a value at the end of year 5. I had a value of 421,226. I had a value of 421,226. 421,226. I am now derecognizing from here 1,53,940. The difference is basically the carrying amount after derecognition. Well, less 153,940 is equal to 2,67,286. All right, so my carrying amount of the lease liability after derecognition is 2,67,286. No, this was basically part one. All right. Remember where we had a modification which was in the nature of decrease in the term lease or decrease in the scope of assets. We had two parts of accounting. Part one was about derecognition, and part two was where we were calculating the revised lease liability and then gave a corresponding adjustment to ROU asset. So here again, we in part two, we are now going to calculate the revised lease liability. So we will be calculating the revised lease liability at the beginning of year 6, revised lease liability at beginning of year 6. Now the revised lease liability is going to be the present value of not 1 lakh, but we have 1,50,000 because we also have additional square meters that we are actually obtaining. All right. The consideration has actually increased on account of increase in the scope. All right. This increase in scope, remember, is not accounted as a separate lease. It's not accounted as a separate lease. Therefore, the revised lease liability will be present value of 1,50,000 for year 6, 7, and 8 discounted at at the current borrowing rate of 7%. All right. So the revised lease liability will actually be calculated as we have years, we have payment that will be made for year 6, payment that will be made for year 7, and payment that will be made for year 8. All right, end of year 6, end of year 7, and end of year 8. Because we are standing at the beginning of year 6, payment at the end of year 6 is 1 year away from today. All right, we are standing at the beginning of year 6, so payment for year 6 is 1 year away from today, payment for year 7 is 2 years away from today, and payment for the 8th year is the 3 years away from today. We have cash flow of 1,50,000. All right, the cash flow is no longer going to remain 1 lakh, it's 1,50,000 for each year, year 6, year 7, and year 8. We then have present value factor calculated at 7%, and we then have discounted cash flow. All right, the present value factor is going to be equal to, for year 6, it's 0.9346. For year 7, it's going to be 0.8734, and for year 8, it is 0.8163. How did I calculate this? This is nothing but 1 divided by 1.07 whole power 1. The second year is 1 divided by 1.07 whole square. And for the third year, it's 1 divided by 1.07 the whole cube. For the first year, discounted cash flow will be 1,50,000 multiplied by 0.9346, which is equal to 1,40,190. For the next year, it is 1,50,000 multiplied by 0.8734, which is 1,31,010 rupees. And for the third year, it's 1,50,000 multiplied by 0.8163, which is equal to 1,22,445. The total of all of this is going to be equal to 3,93,645. All right, so the revised lease liability that we have is equal to 3,39,645. The carrying amount of the lease liability after derecognition in the books is 2,67,286. After the derecognition in the books of accounts, the carrying amount of lease liability is 267,286. I now have to increase it to 3,39,645. I have to now increase it to 3,39,645, which is the revised lease liability. Therefore, the increase in lease liability is going to be equal to 339,645 less 267,286, that is equal to 72,359. Corresponding to this increase in lease liability, I will actually increase ROU asset. Corresponding to the increase in lease liability of 72,359, I will be increasing ROU asset. All right, so the journal entry will be ROU asset debit of 72,359 and credit lease liability of 72,359. All right, so in my books, I have a lease liability of 267. I have to increase it to 339 because this is the revised lease liability based on my calculation that I've done today. Accordingly, I need to increase lease liability by 72,359. Increasing lease liability means that we are crediting lease liability. Correspondingly, I will debit my ROU asset. I will increase my ROU asset by 72,359. All right, finally, we'll have carrying amount of ROU asset. The carrying amount of ROU asset after modification. After modification, earlier we had the carrying amount after derecognition. After 40% derecognition was what we had earlier. The amount was equal to 228,01. All right, the carrying amount of ROU asset after 40% derecognition was 2,20,801. I am now increasing it by 72,359. The primary reason for this increase is because the scope of the asset has increased. I have now taken a higher square meters in space, a higher square meters, I think of 1,500 in space. So therefore, that is increasing my ROU asset. It is going to be 228,01 plus 72,359, which is equal to 2,93,160. Same way, I have carrying amount of lease liability after modification. The carrying amount of lease liability after modification is going to be equal to the revised lease liability itself. It will be equal to the revised lease liability. I can actually calculate it. If I want to calculate it, I can do it as I have a carrying amount after derecognition of 267,286. I have a carrying amount of 267,286. To that, I am increasing the liability by 72,359. So therefore, my liability will be 267,286 plus 72,359, which is equal to 3,39,645, and it will match with my revised lease liability. All right, because I calculated the 72 as a differential figure, obviously my lease liability after modification will be equal to 3,39,645. All right, so we have broken it down into two parts, exactly like how we did it earlier. Under part one, we do the derecognition based on decrease in the lease term. Under part two, we calculate the revised lease liability, see how much the lease liability has to change by. Correspondingly, we also change ROU asset by a same amount. All right, we have given the effect to both decrease in lease term as well as increase in the square meters. We have given the effect to both decrease in the lease term as well as increase in the square meters because we considered the future lease payments as 1,50,000. The fact that we considered the future lease payments as 1,50,000 means that this lease liability is after considering the increase in the scope of lease, and corresponding adjustment is given to ROU asset. All right, so that way we account for modification over here. With that, we are done with illustration number 37 and all the illustrations under modification of leases. All right. Remember, you actually have to have this map in your mind. All right. Have this map in your mind. All right. And then you actually have to evaluate under which category this falls into. All right. Every time you see a question, have this map in your mind, evaluate where it actually falls into. Decrease in lease term and decrease in the scope of lease alone result in derecognition. Where there's a decrease in lease term or decrease in the scope of lease, that would result in a derecognition of ROU asset and lease liability and a corresponding gain or loss. And then you have to follow revised lease liability calculation. All right. In all the other cases, it's directly calculation of revised lease liability, whether it's a change in consideration or an increase in the lease term or any increase in the scope which is not commensurate. You directly calculate revised lease liability, compare it with the existing carrying amount, and the corresponding adjustment will be given to ROU asset. Where the increase is in where there's an increase in the scope of lease with the consideration which is commensurate to the standalone price, then it is treated as a separate lease itself. You account for it as a new lease. Do not touch the existing ROU asset and lease liability. All right. So that is how we are actually dealing with illustration number 30. I think we just got done with illustration number 37. All right. I don't know. Actually, I put illustration 37 under this heading. Maybe it's actually supposed to go into this heading. All right. Where it is not commensurate to the standalone selling price. All right. Thank you, everyone. Bye bye.